Hello there, and welcome back to the Spiral Lab live stream. I'm Marta, and the Spiral Lab is a channel dedicated to art, theory, and design, all through a critical and neurodivergent lens. And it's a collaboration between me and Jesse Meadows, who sometimes joins me on the live stream. We've been on a hiatus for about 2 months now, but it's our hope to get back to a mostly weekly schedule for this coming season. And I have to admit that I'm feeling a little anxious. I had gotten this down to sort of a science and did it every week, and it felt kind of natural and normal, but now I'm just feeling all a little fluttery. So if you want to say hi in the chat, introduce yourself, that always helps calm my nerves. I'm really looking forward to seeing some old friends in the chat and hopefully some new faces as well. Please do introduce yourself. And also throughout the stream today, feel free to add comments or questions. And I'm just going to say hi to Jamie. Thanks so much for saying hi. And Adina. Okay, so here we go. Some familiar faces. Really nice to see you. It really means a lot. Here's Spiral Nerd, my friend Bug. Great to see you. Invisible Design. Hi, I'm joining from Mexico and live in Denmark. Yay, how wonderful. And I also love your handle, Invisible Design. That's great. Oh, look at this. Dan Glenn is here. Hi, the Burnout newsletter you just sent was so incredibly relatable. Thank you. Dan, I hope that this isn't going to be too much of a repeat, but I am going to be talking about a lot of the stuff that I've been sharing in my newsletter over the last couple of weeks. And if people are interested in receiving that newsletter, I guess I could drop a link below in the description. But also, if you ever do want to sign up for my newsletter, anytime that you'd like download any of my ebooks or anything like that, that puts you automatically onto the newsletter. Oh my gosh, what a lovely Julia's here, another old friend. Sarah's here. Yeah, Sarah, I just saw you. I get notifications that you joined a whole bunch of the labs in Divergent Design Studios. That's great. Just joined today. I'm from the US and live in Barcelona. Fantastic. So glad to see you. Oh, this is making me so happy to see you all here. I'm going to be brave and make myself do this little commercial break that I had decided I was going to do and then almost chickened out. But the Spiral Lab is more and more something that Jesse and I would like to do for a living, and it's supported by our very generous patrons. If you'd like to support me and Jesse and the work we do on this channel, I will put the link in the description below to our Patreon. And if you're not able to commit to a recurring monthly contribution, but would like to support us through one-time contributions, you can always use the super chat feature during this live stream. And that's the end of the commercial. Today's topic is burnout, which feels like a really timely one for our first episode of the new season, since part of the reason we had to go on a hiatus this summer was because I was, in fact, experiencing a pretty significant burnout. And that's what I want to talk about today. And particularly, I want to share some sort of ideas and definitions about what burnout is. I want to share some of my own experiences with burnout, and in particular with burnout as an artist and a creative. And then I want to also talk about how my perspective on burnout is shifting somewhat, especially through my experience this past summer. But first, I'm going to go say hi to a few more people. Marin says, hi, new member here too. Looking forward to the live stream today. Great to have you, Marin. Very happy to have you also at Divergent Design Studios. If you don't know, Divergent Design Studios is a community on the Mighty Networks platform that offers peer support and all kinds of other great creative stuff to neurodivergent folks. So if you'd like to join us, that link is or will be, I can't remember what I put in the description, down in the description. New says, hi, I'm Noosh. I'm in Brighton, UK. Oh my goodness. I was in Brighton last spring briefly, and it's like one of my very favorite places in the whole world, and I'd love to go back. I was only there for like a weekend, but I'd like to go back for a whole month sometime. It's just a really lovely spot. Welcome everybody. Great to see you all. And I have to say, I'm feeling much calmer now. So thank you. Thank you for indulging my anxiety at the beginning of the live stream. I want to start, and again, those of you who get my newsletter, some of this is going to be a repeat of what I've been talking about there. But I want to start with this study that Jessie sent me about autistic burnout. Oh, and here we go. Michelle, another familiar face from Dublin. Nice to see you, Michelle. I love that we're such an international crowd and that people are here from all over the world. How lovely. All right, so this study, I'm gonna put it up here in my no, that's not it. Here we go. There we go. This is this study that Jessie sent me this summer that I think is really kind of interesting about autistic burnout. It's called Having All Your Internal Resources Exhausted Beyond Measure and Being Left with No Cleanup Crew, Defining Autistic Burnout. And I don't really believe that we need researchers to tell us about our experiences or to make them valid or real. But I did think that this study and the sort of definition of burnout that it offers was really interesting and kind of validating for me. And I especially liked that the lead researcher of the study is themselves autistic. So that, to me, like I really believe in that hashtag, nothing about us without us. And that meant that, to me, that makes the study kind of valid. And I also want to point out that although this study is technically about autistic burnout, I think that it really speaks to the experience of burnout for many, many types of neurodivergent people and even more broadly disabled people. So if you're not autistic or don't identify as autistic, I hope you'll stick around because I still think that this is a really relatable topic. And in fact, the authors of the study say that although we specifically focused on autistic burnout, it is possible that people with other disabilities and people with chronic illness may experience similar experience of burnout. And they went on to explain one of the reasons that they decided to do this study, which is different from lots of other autism research or neurodivergence research, in that A, it was led by an autistic person, and B, it was completely focused on the actual lived experiences as related of autistic people as related by autistic people. And the researchers said that one of the reasons that they wanted to do that, to like talk to us autistic people about our experiences of burnout, was because, quote, despite how often and urgently the autistic community discusses autistic burnout, the concept is almost completely absent from the academic and clinical literature. Which is sad, but not surprising, right? So I'm going to take this down now, and I will put a link to that study. I will also put a link to that study in the description if you'd like to take a look at it. I just thought it was really interesting. It's a qualitative study, so it's not like full of like statistics and numbers and stuff like that. And I found it really readable and really relatable. But the crux of what the researchers found when they talked to lots and lots of different autistic people about their experiences of burnout was this. Autistic adults described the primary characteristics of autistic burnout as chronic exhaustion, loss of skills, and reduced tolerance to stimulus. They described burnout as happening because of life stressors that added to the cumulative load they experienced, and barriers to support that created an inability to obtain relief from that load. These pressures caused expectations to outweigh abilities, resulting in autistic burnout. Autistic adults described negative impacts on their health, capacity for independent living, and quality of life, including, content warning, suicidal behavior. They also discussed a lack of empathy from neurotypical people and described acceptance and social support, time off and reduced expectations, and doing things in an autistic way / unmasking as associated in their experiences with recovery from autistic burnout. So, again, when I read this, I actually kind of teared up a little bit because it just so described so many of my experiences in my life. The chronic fatigue, the loss of skills, and the reduced tolerance to stimulus. Yeah, so when I look back at experiences that I've had over my life, which I've often, at the time, I often chalked up to like clinical depression or acute anxiety. And I certainly did feel depressed and anxious. That wasn't untrue. But I sort of chalked it up to that old narrative that is now getting discredited of like, oh, it's just about my brain. It's just some chemical imbalance in my brain. That was sort of the best case scenario of how I would describe these experiences to myself in the past. And the much more common and kind of brutal self-critical way I would describe those experiences was just that I was too intense, too sensitive, um, and or like lazy, incompetent, entitled. Like there were all these really negative ways that I would explain myself to myself. Um, but in reality, what I was feeling like was just like rubbed raw. Like I had a therapist who said to me, it's like you don't have any skin. And that is exactly how it felt, like just not having any skin left. And that the work of recovering from that was the work of growing a new skin. That's how this therapist described it to me. And that really did, that really resonates still. But now I realize it's not just because I have a thin skin. Although I do think that that's part of it, right? That like, especially for neurodivergent people, I just think that we're just more sensitive than other people. I think lots of people can experience burnout, but I think that we probably experience it more often and more acutely because of our peculiar sensitivities and our inability to filter out sensation, basically. So that when we're being really bombarded by it and we're not getting support and we're like, you know, our self-talk is super critical and all of that, I think it just happens more often and more intensely. For me, my burnouts often were associated with employment, with my jobs. I worked as a lawyer for almost 5 years, and I think that I was probably in a state of burnout during the whole time that I was working as a lawyer. 2 years I worked as a clerk for a federal judge, and then 3 years I worked as an associate in a law firm here in Philadelphia. And and that, I mean, that was probably the most intense experience of burnout that I had associated with work. But the truth is that every job that I've ever had, I was a high school English teacher for a while in my early 20s. That also just sort of the overstimulation and um, the constant sensory bombardment of working in high school, um, left me also just feeling completely burnt out. And because I didn't understand what it was I needed, and I didn't understand how it was possible to get it, those burnouts would often last for a really long time, and I would just be really debilitated by them. Um, there was another time that I'm going to talk about this in a second, but so definitely burnout for me is often associated with work and employment, um, and like it's one of the main reasons that I feel like I'm disabled by the work world, because it almost always leads to burnout. Like I've just never had a job that didn't end up burning me out like really quickly to the point of being incapacitated and unable to continue. Um, but I've also found that my burnout is sometimes associated with creative work, with creative projects. In particular, as much as I love talking about interior design and home renovation, the truth is that I've had some really intense periods of burnout in the midst of interior design projects and home renovation projects. Um, in particular, I'm remembering a time when in my previous home that I shared with my ex-wife and children, we had our basement. It was a tiny little row house, and we didn't have a lot of room in it. And so we had the basement renovated, and it involved these workers literally digging out the floor to create a little bit more headroom in the basement. And it was just like dirt and dust and people in my home all the time. And it was just like really overwhelming. And I definitely had a burnout during that period. But there are other times where like work and creative work, like earning a living work and doing artistic creative things, kind of work, like those two different types of work end up overlapping. And this is actually something that we've been talking about this past week in peer support at Divergent Design Studios, the sort of difficulty sometimes in, we've been talking specifically about rest and play, but what has come up in these conversations is that it's often difficult to put work and rest and play into like really clear and neat and discrete categories. Um, and I think that sometimes for me anyway, when the lines blur, um, that can lead to some sensory overload for me for sure. Especially I find um, when you're a person who's a creative person in some way, it doesn't have to be like visual art specifically, but just any sort of creative endeavor. When you're trying to turn that into a living, when you're trying to monetize your creative life, so that you can, um, support yourself financially, like that is I think, an especially difficult situation for many of us, and can often lead to burnout, and has in my life led to burnout. Um, yeah, so I think that one of the reasons, especially in my own experience, that um, that the combination of like work and creativity when I'm trying to make a living at my creative work, which frankly is sort of what I'm trying to do here on the Spiral Lab, right? That part of why that can be so hard and can ultimately lead to burnout is because it's sort of by definition a public thing that you're doing. And so it um, it comes with all of these outside expectations, which sometimes we create ourselves, right? Like we make announcements about our intentions, about our plans, about what's coming next. Um, and then because of those expectations from the outside, we end up feeling a lot of shame, I think. And I think that I think that shame is toxic all the time, but I also think that it can really acutely add to the load that leads to burnout. Um, and this is exactly what happened to me in one of my previous jobs that I was sort of creating for myself. And I wanted to just tell you a tiny bit about that, and then talk about why my burnout this summer felt kind of different. Um, so it was probably, well, my son was 4 and he's 19 now. So I guess this was like 15 years ago. Um, I ran a summer camp, a literacy summer camp for kids in a neighborhood called Kensington in Philadelphia, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in Philadelphia and is sort of the it may still be, I don't know, the epicenter in many ways nationally of the opioid crisis. So it's a neighborhood where people struggle a lot with poverty and addiction and other things. And I was running a camp through my church at the time, for kids in that neighborhood. And then out of that camp, I started an after school program the following fall. And I was like, it was my special interest, it was my passion. I was devoted to it. I put so much of myself into that program. I put so much of my own money into the program, my time, my energy. I was leading a whole team of people who were the counselors um, and parents who were involved, and it was just a really big thing that felt really important to me. And then that very fall, I don't know, most of you are probably too young to even remember this whole scandal with Bernie Madoff, but he was basically running a Ponzi scheme and he was getting especially like small family foundations to invest their money with him. Um, and it turned out to just be a complete Ponzi scheme, and there was nothing left once it all tumbled down, and that happened like right after this program got launched. Um, and many of the funders of our program, it was all grant funded, were these small family foundations, and their endowments just disappeared, and they could no longer fund us. Um, and then on top of that, it turned out, like in the financial crisis, it turned out that there wasn't nearly as much institutional support from the church that I was running the program through as I had thought there was. And that part of it was probably my naivete, and my sort of projecting my own enthusiasm and passion for this project onto other people. Um, but certainly the Bernie Madoff scandal, like there was no way that I could have anticipated that. There was nothing in my control about that situation at all. There was nothing I could do when the funding dried up, and we just had to close up the program. All of these counselors who were going to be, working for me lost their jobs. I mean, it was just really terrible. Um, and I experienced, like, I'm still kind of coming to terms with my shame around um, that whole catastrophe. Even though I know objectively now that there was nothing that I did that was shameful, that it was just this thing that was out of my control. But I had such an intense burnout at the end of that, and shame that just like lasted for years and years and years and disrupted relationships. Like I like avoided the counselors and I avoided their families, and I just stopped believing that I was capable of creating something, right? Like, um, yeah, so it was intense. And my response in the in in the midst of this intense burnout that literally lasted for years was just to make myself really small, to like not try anything, to not be creative, um, certainly not to try to create community. Um, And I was just sure, I mean, telling the story now and looking back on it, it seems so obvious to me that this wasn't the case. But at the time, I was just sure that I was the problem, that it was my too muchness. I used to talk about the unbearable too muchness of being me. Like I had this metaphor in my brain for how I would describe this sensation that I had, and I told it to my therapist, different and better therapist than the one I told you about before. This is the therapist who actually sort of helped me save my life when I left my first marriage. But how I would describe it is that I felt like I was like this porcelain doll who had cracks in the porcelain, and inside the doll there was this flame, and people loved what they could see of the flame. They loved the glow of the flame as it came through the cracks. But if I turned the fire up, if I got really passionate about something, the flame would like escape me, and it would burn not only me but everything else down. Like I was sure that I had burned down the after school program, right? That I had burned my bridges with all of these people, my big swaths of my community. Um, yeah, so I was sure that the problem was that I was too much, and that when I turned my flame up, it would burn things up, me and everything around me. When I told my therapist about this, and this is one of the ways that I knew that my therapist was the right therapist for me, it was early on, and it was a really key aha moment. He immediately thought of a poem. That's always a good sign, right? by by a poet that he especially loved. Um, my therapist was a Korean man who had been himself a poet and a playwright and an actor and an activist for many years in Korea before he became a psychiatrist. And I wanted to share this poem with you um, that he was reminded of as I was telling him that story. The poem is by a poet named Kim Chun-soo, and it's called Prologue for a Flower. And it was in particular the first couple of lines that he was thinking of. And I don't actually think that this is the best translation that I just found, because the translation that I'm thinking my therapist told me was a tiny bit different, like a tiny bit more nuanced. But anyway, the poem goes like this. Prologue for a Flower. I am a dangerous animal. The moment my hand touches you, you become the unknown darkness. On the end of the trembling branch of being, you blossom and fall nameless. I weep throughout the night. And in the unnameable darkness, tears overflow, kindling a memory. My weeping becomes a whirlwind that could topple buildings and becomes gold light inside a stone. Anyway, I just thought I would share that with you, but that like really summed up. I mean, it's a different metaphor. My metaphor was fire. This poet's metaphor is darkness and light within a stone. Um, but that was my sense for most of my life, that when I experienced burnout, whether it was from a job, but more importantly, when it was because I had engaged in some sort of creative endeavor, and especially when that was, connected to my efforts to make a living for myself, as this after school program was, I just thought that I was too much, that the problem was me, that I was too intense, that I burned too bright, and that I was just incapable of, you know, doing anything in a sort of measured way. So I decided that the solution, the way to avoid flaming out, was to stay cool and small, to stop flying so close to the sun. And that's what I did for a really long time. Like like literally until, 6 or 7 years ago. That's what I did. That was my solution. Before I continue going, um, I'm gonna go look at a few of these comments because I see that there have been a couple of comments coming in. We have Charlie from France. How fun. Hi, Charlie. New says, come back to Brighton. I intend to, believe me. In fact, I'm writing a novel that's set right around Brighton, which was part of the reason I went. Also to go to Charleston, which is the Bloomsbury House, which was sort of the highlight. I mean, we were really only there for a weekend so that we could go to Charleston, but I definitely want to come back. Michelle says, how can we sign up to your newsletter? I'm going to put a link in the description. I'll also put a link in DDS. But if you go to my website, which I think is still martarose.com, and if you sign up for any of the free resources that I have there, any of my ebooks or anything like that, like I give those to you for free in exchange for your email address, basically. So that's another way to do it. Hi everyone, it's Jill. Happy I made it. I'm happy you made it too, Jill. Another DDS familiar face and beloved friend. So glad you're here. And yet another one. DDS is showing up for me. Thank you so much, folks. Ketsia is here, tuning in from my local library. Yay, how fun. Enjoying listening so far. I'm glad to hear that. Dan says work was everything. It was the only thing that was consistent. Everything else was in disarray. Well, that's interesting. I'm glad that you had that experience. My experience has been just exactly the opposite. Julie says, that's so hard, Marta. I'm assuming you're talking, and that's a huge disappointment about the Bernie Madoff thing. Yeah, it was rough, believe me. Paint is in the house, another old friend and DDS friend. So nice to see you, Paint. Adina says, beautiful poem. Yeah, I think I'll put that in the description as well, if I remember all these things. I agree, Adina, it's a beautiful poem. And sometimes I want to get a tattoo of that first line, but I've got to get my therapist, my psychiatrist to to write it for me in Korean, I think is how I would like to do it. Drew says, just tuning in right before my therapy session seems fitting. So glad to have you, Drew. I hope that yeah, it's helpful and that therapy is helpful. Glad you're here for as long as you can be. All right, that's the rest of the comments. Feel free to keep adding comments for sure. And I will definitely turn back to them in just a little bit. But now I'm going to turn back to my story. I wrote a lot of notes for this. I did it during our studio time, which is what we call body doubling in DDS. DDS, by the way, if you're watching this as a replay and you're not sure what I'm talking about, again, DDS is Divergent Design Studios, which is a community on the Mighty Networks platform for neurodivergent people to offer peer support to one another. And anyway, I made all these notes during studio time this morning. And then I was worried that maybe I had over-prepared, but actually I'm finding that it's really helpful. So, but now I'm going to try to reorient myself. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so in the wake of that particular burnout, but really all of my burnouts in the past, I would decide that I was the problem, that I was just too much, that I burned everything up, not just myself, but everything that I touched with any sort of passion or intensity or creativity just burned up. And so that the solution was to make myself small. And that's what I did for years and years, was to do my best to make myself really small so that I wouldn't burn things up. But then, wouldn't you know it, it turned out that the smallness became even more dangerous than the fire. I mean, I think that when I look back on the decision ultimately to leave my previous marriage and turn my entire life upside down and shake it really hard and have like pretty much everything fall out. Um, that decision happened when my fear of the smallness became stronger than my fear of the fire, right? And it was that same therapist, the one who shared that poem with me, um, who's also my psychiatrist. He's just a really great guy who helped me to see that and helped me to have the courage to leave that that situation, that marriage. And it wasn't just the marriage, like the whole situation. But really it wasn't. I just want to be clear, it wasn't really about courage. It was really about one fear outweighing the other fear. You know, the fear that I was going to die and never really have lived became even greater than my fear of burning everything up. So I left that marriage, and in fact, all of the fears that I had had about leaving that marriage came true, and it was a really, really rough time. Um, but I made it through with the help of my therapist, with the help of my partner, and a handful of friends, um, and without really at the time having the language to describe it. Um, I have the language now, but at the time I didn't really have the language, or was just beginning to get the language of unmasking, but I was doing it like fairly intensely, starting this process of unmasking. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, there's a great book by Dr. Devin Price called Unmasking Autism: The New Faces of Neurodiversity, which I can't recommend highly enough. And not just because he cites my work on interior design. It's just a really great book, and I recommend that you read it. But as I was in this process of unmasking, it turned out that art and creating and being a creative person and allowing myself the space and time and resources to do that was central, was crucial. In fact, this is the time in my life when I started making visual art. um, I mean, I've now come to understand my interior design work in my home as a form of visual art, and that I've been doing that my whole life, sort of using my home and the walls in my home and the gardens outside my home as a sort of canvas where I put my visual art. I At the time I didn't really think of myself as an artist in that context, but I eventually did actually start making visual art in kind of a traditional sense. I started drawing and painting both abstractly and realistically, and I'm not very good at it, and it's nothing that I'm ever going to try to monetize or turn myself into a professional about or anything like that. But it was really central to my experience of unmasking, because what I found was that once I realized that I've been living with this mask on, this like mask of smallness in many ways, for so many years, that when I took the mask off, when I started to peel the mask away, I initially expected that like the real me would be underneath. And what it turned out more was like I wasn't really sure who or what I was underneath, and that I kind of had to create myself. I mean, it's not like I was starting from scratch by any means, but there was a lot of kind of molding and shaping that had to go on. And I'd always thought of myself as a writer, but this was a particular time, and I think it was associated with some of the traumas that I had been through in my divorce, that like words just sort of stopped being, um, I stopped having access to words in a creative way in the way I had in the past as a writer. And so I just turned to drawing and to just like putting paint on paper and canvases. And it was really central to my unmasking process. But even as I was doing all of that and sort of coming to understand myself and coming to understand myself more as an artist and coming to give myself permission to be a creative person, to claim that. Like, it still feels a little audacious to call myself an artist, but it's an audacity that I'm willing to embrace, um, because it's been so life-saving, right? But even in the midst of all of that, I think I still somehow thought that burnout was something to be avoided, um, and especially this sort of burnout related to creativity where you like make big splashy proclamations and you tell people what you're working on and you know get all excited about it and set goals and I don't know what, like say this is what I'm doing, sort of make it public and make it known. There's a particular, I think, kind of burnout and shame that comes from, well, a particular kind of shame that comes from um, those things not working out, and they often don't. um, and they often don't because I think that burnout is kind of inevitable. But initially, what I thought was that no, burnout is still something to be avoided at all costs. Um, and especially this burnout and shame about our art, about the messiness of the process, about the expectations and the announcements and all of that, right? Um, I really thought that 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 was still something that I wanted to avoid and that I could avoid in this new sort of phase of my life. That like now that I had sort of, I don't know, maybe I don't know what the right metaphor is, but like I had sort of burst out of that porcelain doll shell and just allowed myself to burn bright. I assumed that that meant that I wouldn't have burnout anymore, right? That I had built a world, I had designed a world and a relationship and a community where it was okay to burn bright, where I wasn't too much, and therefore I wouldn't experience burnout anymore. And that has not proven to be true at all. In fact, in the time since that was probably like in the last 5 years, that I've had this sort of new perspective and new sense of myself as an artist, as a creative person, as a person who has a right to that, as a person who is now solidly within a community that honors that and supports that. Um, yeah, I've had several burnouts still. And the first couple of times it happened, I thought, oh, I must be doing something wrong because this isn't supposed to happen. And I don't I don't know what I'm doing wrong anymore because I'm not going to blame myself in the same way. Um, but I was still like trying to figure out how to avoid it, how to create sort of a smooth, even, easy life right down the middle, um, that would avoid burnout. Um, but what I think I have come to understand, and this is just for me, your mileage may vary, and your experiences of burnout may be very different. Maybe they're more toxic, maybe they're more debilitating. Um, but for me, what I think I've come to understand is that as, as a creative person, as an artist, I don't think that I can avoid the messiness. I don't think that I can avoid or even want to avoid the excitement and the big splashy announcements. Um, I don't I don't want to be creating in a vacuum outside of community, which means that there are going to be expectations from people. Um, it's just all part of it, is what I'm coming to understand, like the messiness, the intensity. The truth is, I want to fly close to the sun sometimes. Like, I don't want to just be flat all the time. in order to avoid the burnout part. Um, but I do think that what we can avoid is the shame. And I don't think that shame and burnout are the same thing, but I think that they're very related. And I think that shame always intensifies the badness of everything. Shame makes everything that is already toxic more toxic. And so, if there's a way that we could avoid the shame around our burnout, then I think that it can help to mitigate some of our experience of burnout, which is now where I am kind of, I think. Um, I think that I'm no longer trying to avoid ever experiencing burnout. I'm just trying to make it be so that it's not quite as in like long lasting and debilitating as the burnouts that I experienced in the past. And that brings me to this summer, this past summer, which many of you already know this story because I've been talking about it a lot in DBS and in the newsletter. But what happened this summer, it was nothing like the whole Bernie Madoff situation at all. But the one similarity is that something happened that was outside of my control. And that's often the case, right? Like I had all these plans this summer, these creative plans, these things that I was going to do. I had in the spring, I had all of this energy. I was really excited. I was turning to the Spiral Lab, to this YouTube channel in a really serious way. I was going to do weekly vlogs leading up to a video essay about interior design. Like all of my passions were coming together in a way that just felt really exciting. And I was finally going to have some like time and space and energy to devote to it. Joel and I were also thinking about starting a new live stream around food and cooking, and we did a few episodes of that. And then some things that were just out of our control happened. One of them was that Joel, who suffers from chronic pain, had a huge pain flare and wasn't able to continue with those live stream plans. And I had a couple of obligations that I knew that I had, but there was no way that suddenly I had to tend to them this summer. It's a long story and I won't bore you with it, but the upshot is that obligations that I knew I had, but that I thought I could tend to at different times, suddenly there were some like serious deadlines and I had to attend to them this summer, and there was nothing I could do about that. And at first I thought, oh, well, I'll just shift a few other things around, but I'm still going to do all these cool creative things that I had planned. And then it just became like increasingly clear that I wasn't going to be able to do that I wasn't going to have the bandwidth to do it. And it just like both the disappointment of it, I think, and just like the sheer effort that I was putting into holding it all together just led to burnout, like a total burnout. So I sort of limped through these two projects that I had to finish this summer, and but that was really all I could do. And I ended up going back on some medication that has been helpful to me in the past to sort of help lift my mood a little bit. And I just took lots and lots of naps. I was sleeping all the time. And fortunately, I'm with a partner who completely supported that. I let the house go. The house was just a disgusting mess for 2 months. And I'm only just now starting to get that back in control. But what I didn't do is feel ashamed of the projects that I had been so excited about and had shared that excitement with other people. In the past, I would have just felt mortified that I had said, oh, I'm going to be vlogging every week and we're going to do this live stream. And I just would have been so ashamed that it probably would have kept me from coming back to the Spiral Lab. Like what would have happened is I would have just decided, you can't be a YouTuber. You just aren't capable of it. You have to give this up and make yourself small again. And that's what I didn't do. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt a little bit embarrassed and a little and very, very disappointed. But I didn't feel ashamed. I didn't feel like I needed to make excuses. I just like, said to people, hey, the things that I thought I was going to be able to do, I can't. Come back in the fall or the spring if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, and we'll try again. And I think that those two things, my my ability to rest as much as I needed without any pressure from my partner and without any shame around that, um, and knowing that I was part of a community, you all in particular, DDS, a handful of close friends that I now have who really understand burnout, like that, I just didn't have to feel ashamed of it. And that was everything. I was still burned out. I was still crying a lot. I was still super anxious all the time. I still felt like I needed to go back on some medication to, help keep my head above water. But I didn't feel like I needed to make myself small. So I guess that's my conclusion is that um and the thing is that the projects that I was so excited about in the spring, if the summer had gone the way that I thought it would, I think it would have worked out. I think I would have vlogged every week, and I think and if Joel hadn't had this pain flare, I think that we would have moved forward with the food live stream. Like the problem wasn't the plans and the excitement and the flying close to the sun. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that life got in the way, and that just happens. Like there's just shit that is outside of our control. But I definitely wouldn't have vlogged, and I definitely wouldn't have started that live stream if I had been like, oh, I'm just too afraid to like make myself, I'm just too much and I don't want to be too much, right? So um, I'm rambling a little bit here, but the upshot is that I want to fly close to the sun sometimes. And sometimes when I do that, it's going to work out. And sometimes when I do that, other things are going to get in the way. And that's just how it is. Being an artist, being a creative person, it's messy. It's just messy. And that's just part of it. Like the process of creating, by definition, is messy. um, and and so find yourself a community that is going to hold you and support you in the mess. That's all I can say. And don't feel ashamed and don't feel like you need to make yourself small because I don't think that that's the solution. And also, don't feel like if you experience some burnout that you have failed. It just means that you tried really hard and it didn't work out this time. And then do the things that you know to take care of yourself, to speak to yourself with compassion, um, to slow way down, to rest a lot, and get the support that you need, and then you can go back to the messiness of creating once you're feeling better. Um, all right, that's pretty much what I have. I'm going to go back and see what you all are saying in the comments because it looks like there's a bunch of stuff. And then I would love if you have other things that please feel free if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, resonances. Shockingly, um, I have talked for less than an hour and I'm done with my remarks. That never happens. I generally tend to go really long, so we have little time. New says, cool, we'll look forward to having you back. Well, I'll definitely let you know the next time I'm around. Adina quoted me, which is a lovely thing that happens a lot actually in peer support at DDS, is that peer support happens on Zoom, and people share in multiple ways, one of which is just to unmute yourself and talk. And often other people will sort of reflect back to the person who's sharing little nuggets of what they've said. It's a really lovely, um, it's a really lovely ritual of peer support in DDS. And Adina has done that for me now, quoting, "The smallness became more dangerous than the fire." Yeah, that's definitely what happened. It was just like one fear started to outweigh the other. It wasn't really about being courageous. It was just about the fear of never having fully lived became more, acute than all of the fears that I had about what would happen if I left my marriage. Julie says, I can so relate to that fear of not living fully, not using my life well. Yeah, yeah, Julie. For me, I think that the timing was very specifically this. My mother died completely unexpectedly of an aneurysm in her brain just short of her 51st birthday. I was 24 years old. Completely unexpected, as far as we knew. In every other way, she was a perfectly healthy person. She was weeding the asparagus and she collapsed, and a couple days later, she died. Um, and and at the time that it wasn't that I had this sort of morbid sense that I was gonna die, that was also gonna happen to me, but it was more like I've had this feeling like if I were to die at the same age as my mother did, um, would I feel satisfied that I had really lived my life the way that I wanted to live my life? And the answer was just so like acutely no. Like there were many things about my life that I loved. My children, are the very heart of me and continue to be, and that. Um, those are wonderful relationships that I feel very proud of. But in so many other ways, I just didn't feel alive in the ways that I dreamed of feeling alive, and I knew that the only way I could do that was to leave my marriage. And so I did, like at about 50 and a half, I left my marriage, um, right around like when my mother was the age that I was when I left my first marriage. She only had months to live. And I always wondered, like, I wonder what she wished she had done differently. And I'm sure there are many things. Um, Invisible Design says, I felt the same regarding unmasking and expecting to discover yourself, but instead having to create who you want to be now. You've started setting your unmasked self free. Yeah, that's well put. That was exactly my experience. Like, I just thought that there was the real me, capital R, capital M, underneath this mask, and that if I just took the mask off, that she would emerge. And instead, what happened is that I had this really intense period of like sort of derealization, of dissociation. And the thing that really grounded me was making marks on surfaces, basically, you know, like putting paint on canvas, um, putting graphite on paper. Like those were the things that sort of felt like they held me together in a way that would allow me to shape who I was going to become. Yeah. Um, Adina Hearts. Shame and burnout are not the same thing. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to remember. And related to that is that shame and embarrassment are not the same thing. I think this is something that I talk about quite a bit, but I think it bears repeating, especially for people who have been traumatized by shame. And I really do think that shame is a form of trauma. That I think one of the things that happens is that a whole range of emotions that are unpleasant but aren't shame, this whole range of emotions ends up triggering shame in us because we don't understand the difference. We sort of come to associate any sensation of emotional sensation that's unpleasant with with shame. And so any kind of unpleasant emotional sensation can spiral into shame and become like really debilitating. Um, and I think that embarrassment is one of those. Like, I felt embarrassed this summer that I had made this big splashy announcement about vlogging and then didn't vlog. Like, I felt some embarrassment for sure, and definitely disappointment and frustration and sad. I felt so sad. Like, I cried so much this summer. um, but those are different than shame. And being able to say, I feel embarrassed, but I am not going to go down this shame spiral. I am not going to like beat up on myself and tell myself how worthless I am. I'm not going to curl up in a ball and make myself small. Um, Knowing the difference has like made such a world of difference in my life. And I think that it's a practice to sort of sit with unpleasant sensations and say, oh, this isn't shame. This is just like disappointment. And I can there I think shame is unbearable. I think there's a whole range of other human emotions that are unpleasant and negative, but they're bearable and they're human. And like, we don't want to have lives. Like, I want to be able to fly close to the sun, but I also want to feel low sometimes. I mean, I don't want to feel low, to be perfectly honest. But when I do, I know that I'm just being a human being, right? Like, that's just part of the human experience and it goes with it. It's sort of like the messiness of creativity. It's all part of it. Um, Spiral Nerd says, oof, I can so relate to that shame and burnout induced sense that I have to entirely abandon a project because the shame, embarrassment is too intense for me to face and circle back to. Yeah. Um, and Bug says, I love and appreciate seeing you model other ways. Well, thank you, Bug. I appreciate you so much. I've learned so much from you as well. I think that one of the most common um, and just to be expected responses to shame is avoidance. Like, the things that we're ashamed of, it's such a intensely toxic experience to be ashamed, to feel shame, that we want to avoid it at all costs. And anything that makes us feel ashamed is something that we're not going to spiral back around to, right? And often I think with our creative projects, it like, if we just feel burned out from them, it's entirely possible that we'll come back from them. But when the burnout has like this whole overlay of shame to it, then the avoidance is there. And yes, I have many projects in my life that I've never returned to just out of shame, out of it, like the avoidance of the shame of it, for sure. Adina says, what Bug said, this is so inspiring. Oh, thank you guys. You guys are so great. I appreciate you all so much. Steph says, Marta, I've been a little MIA from DDS, but I just want to say that I'm crying right now because I can relate so much to the shame keeping you from coming back and trying again. You helped me feel so seen. Oh, thank you, Steph. And there's no need to, I mean, you're not exactly apologizing, but you don't have to explain yourself. DDS is always there. That's the beauty of it. And people will spiral in and out of it as well, for sure. But don't ever let shame keep you away. Like, I think that happens. I think people join DDS and then they don't get involved right away, or they get involved in a big way and then they sort of fade away, and then they feel ashamed about it, and so they avoid coming back. And let's not let that happen ever, okay? It's really fine to come and go always. Emerald Gem, who I know is Jill, says, I really think this concept that the plans we announce sometimes need to change is so valuable. That when life makes the plans change, we can accept it and defer or change the plans. Yeah. Yeah, I think that for a while, I came to the conclusion that I should just not ever tell anybody about anything that I was working on. I should never make announcements. But that means is that I'm never going to share my excitement. I'm never going to bring those people into the circle of my art. Like, I mean, I do think that there is something to be said for not making huge splashy announcements before you're fairly sure that you're going to be able to follow through at least in some way, which I had done this summer. Like I didn't announce that I was going to be vlogging until I had 2 vlogs in the hopper and was editing the 3rd one. Like I thought, oh, well, that makes sense. Like I can now tell people that I'm doing this because I've like backed it up, you know? And even then it just didn't work out. But yeah, I think that it's okay to be excited. And I think it's okay to tell people what you're working on. And then it's okay to say, yeah, that didn't work out. You know, it just didn't work out. I had to change my plans for sure. Steph says, I'm so glad it was different for you this time around and it didn't keep you from coming back. Yeah, thank you. Me too. Me too. Julie says, also, yes, it's about overextendedness when you are solo versus in a system, team, or community for sure. I do think that I think that's a big thing, Julie. I think that especially for those of us, I think that we neurodivergent creatives have this like real tension between needing to be alone but also needing other people and social anxiety and social burnout versus needing to be held in community. Like it's tough. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've sort of found a balance between having a really small local community of people who I see face to face, like bodies in a room. Um, that I keep really small. Sometimes I think I would like to expand it a little bit, but the thought of spending more time with more bodies in a room is kind of overwhelming. But what balances it out is DDS, is the virtual community that I have, which really works for me. So that's how it works for me. Emerald Gem says, P.S. I also love flying close to the sun in small ways, and sometimes I fall, and honestly, that makes me happy. Yep, exactly. Um, Julie says, because in this summer's burnout, a whole community could continue to hold the goals and belief in your project. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like, I mean, I had Jessie, who I do the Spiral Lab with, and we do have some big kind of exciting plans for this fall. Which I haven't announced yet, sort of out of an abundance of caution, but maybe I will soon. Like ginning up my own courage to like walk my talk. Uh, but this is the beginning of it, right? Is just like getting back on the horse of the live stream. But Jessie is both like a Jessie lives in Philadelphia, so Jessie is both a bodies in the room friend and a virtual friend. And that has been really helpful because Jessie completely understands burnout and there's never any pressure from them. And then the same with all of you. Like, I mean, I'm amazed. I'm just amazed that you all came back. Like, not only did I come back after 2 months, but last week I announced in a big splashy way that I was coming back after 2 months. And then I had to cancel the live stream because I couldn't find this specific piece of equipment that is absolutely required in order to do the live stream. And so I had to order a whole new one. And then wouldn't you know, literally right before the live stream started, I found it. And it was literally right in front of me. It's a little black dummy battery that instead of an actual battery in my camera, this dummy battery allows me to plug the camera into an outlet for a continuous charge because a regular battery wouldn't let me ramble on for quite so long. It would die too soon. And that little black dummy battery was literally sitting on the black printer that's right in front of me. And I didn't see it because they were both black. And I just found it when I was setting up the camera again this morning. So anyway, that's another example too. Like I was disappointed and frustrated last week when I couldn't do the live stream and even a little bit embarrassed, but I wasn't ashamed. And then look at you all, you came. You came and showed up. It means so much to me. Invisible Design says, I feel like shame is my big enemy and really want to explore more on how to mitigate it and show more self-compassion instead. I I mean, if you're familiar with my work, Invisible Design, um, I really think that shame is so much at the heart. Again, I think of shame as a form of trauma. So I think lots of traumas, but shame especially, shape our lives and our experiences so much as neurodivergent people, as disabled people, and um, and I think that learning how to disrupt that is really key um, to our healing and to our designing lives that work for us on our own terms. Um, and um, I haven't read as much of Brene Brown as I should, but shame is sort of her area of expertise. And one of the things that Brene Brown says is that shame loves silence, and that when we speak our shameful experiences out loud, when we tell somebody else the thing that is making us feel ashamed, it almost always um, debilitates the shame instead of debilitates us. She recommends having a very small circle of people. I think she says you should be able to write the names of the people that you trust and honor to share your shame with on a sticky note. But what I will say is that that is a big part of what we do in peer support at DDS. I really think that that's the magic of peer support, is that we can say out loud the things that we're ashamed of, and everybody in the room, nobody in the room rolls their eyes at us. Nobody in the room says, "Oh my God, you did that." Instead, what we do is we're like, "Oh yeah, I did that too." Oh wow, yeah, I totally relate. And it's like magic. It really is. Um, Steph says, I wrote a note to myself to go back and verify the quote, but you said something about shame always increases the badness of everything. Yeah, that's probably how I phrased it. But yeah, I think that no matter what bad thing happens to you, if you also feel shame about it, it just becomes like to the nth degree bad. Um, a nice heart from Michelle. Jill has to go. Thank you, Jill, for being here. Michelle says, your quote reminds me of the Anais Nin one, and the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. That is exactly what it was, what happened to me. And not to scare anybody off, but like there was this whole host of, I had been thinking about leaving that marriage for a long time, or sort of in the back of my mind. But there was this whole host of fears that I had about terrible things that would happen to me, um, if and to my children if I did that. Um, and in fact, every single one of those terrible things did in fact happen, and more. So it's not like it was without consequence. It was completely with consequence, and it was a very, very traumatic time in my life. But in the end, worth it. Um, Lou says, accepting burnout helps me handle it better. Sometimes it can't be avoided. So much things out of our control can happen. Yes, Lou, exactly. And I think that burnout is one of those things that, like, the more you resist it, the worse it gets. And that when you sort of surrender to it without shame and allow yourself to rest and allow yourself to do the things that you need to do to take care of yourself, um, that can actually sort of counterintuitively make it less bad. I completely 100% agree with you. M. Dot says, is there any difference between autistic burnout and ADHD burnout? That's a great question. The study that I cited, I don't know if you were here at the beginning, but the study I cited at the beginning of this live stream was looking specifically at ADHD or at autistic burnout based in the experiences of autistic people. Um, I'm not really a huge believer in these neat little diagnostic boxes that the psychiatric industry likes to put us into. Like, I'm not a big fan of the DSM. Um, I mostly now identify myself as neurodivergent or even just disabled. Um, but which is all to say that I think that there's a really fuzzy line between autism and ADHD. I think there's a whole lot of overlap for so many of us. And no, I don't. I think that what characterizes so much of neurodivergence is just um, sort of being hyper permeable to sensation, right? Like we have lots of antennas and very few filters, and so we're just like easily overwhelmed by sensation. Um, and I think that sort of shows up in different ways if you're primarily autistic and you're primarily ADHD. But I think that is often what leads to burnout, is just being overwhelmed by sensation, and not having. That was one of the things that was really important in that study, was that it was like the cumulative load of just being alive and not having enough support and not having empathy from the neurotypical people in our lives that led to burnout. So I mean, these are just vague. These are all sort of vague terms, and again, what the study, um, what the researchers found when they did a search, like a lit search about autistic burnout, is that it's just not really studied. Like nobody is really, outside of autistic researchers and autistic people ourselves, nobody's really interested in the experience of burnout. So it's not really something that um, it's something that autistic people talk a lot about. I think ADHD people, and I sort of consider myself both, like do and should talk about, but I don't really think that there's fundamentally a difference. No, that was a really long-winded answer, wasn't it? Sorry. um, Ketsia says, this is gnarly, Marta. Separating shame from the other emotions we could experience is such a conscious practice. Yes, but it's also so liberating. Ketsia, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think that almost all of this, like recovery, healing, design, um, it's all a practice. It's not a destination. It's not like a thing that we're going to arrive at and then suddenly our life is going to be a way that we dreamed of. I think that it's all just a continuous practice of being. And I don't, yeah, I totally agree. 100%. Wildflower Sar, I'm not sure how you say that, says, I've only just joined in. I'd have loved to have seen the first hour. Will this be saved? I relate so much. Absolutely. I think it takes YouTube like a couple of moments to sort of render, but almost simultaneously after I hit end, this will appear as a recording on the Spiral Lab YouTube channel. And I would love to have you watch it and leave me some comments in the regular comment section about what you think about the first hour. Ren says, that's me with my water and my phone. I added stickers to my phone and now I never lose it. That's great. Joe says, I think I don't even know how to identify the difference between shame and other emotions like embarrassment. Oh, hi, Peter. Nice to see you. Yeah, that's something that we should maybe do a peer support group topic about. Um, I think it's not easy. I've told this story in the past, so at the risk of repeating myself for some of you, it was sort of a revelation to me that happened maybe about a year ago when I had planned this big family event where people were coming from various places on the East Coast and meeting at Longwood Gardens, which is this wonderful garden outside of Philadelphia that we are members of. And it's sort of Joel's and my special place, and we go there often. And I had been in charge of getting tickets for this day that we were going to Longwood Garden, and we all met and we're in the line and we're almost up to the kiosk, and I'm looking up the tickets on my phone and I realized they're not for that day. They are in fact for the following Sunday. and I'm just feeling like devastated. And we try to convince them to let us in anyway, and there was just no way. This was like during like the sort of in between shutdowns, but like they were only letting so many people into the gardens at a time, blah, blah, blah. And everybody in my family was so wonderful and understanding and like, oh, these things happen. And like, we're all neurodivergent in lots of different ways. And it was like, they were super supportive, and we did figure out something else to do. And it wasn't as fun as having gone into the gardens would have been. And I did avoid going into that shame spiral. Like I was very conscious, like, oh, this is an opportunity to feel ashamed that you're going to resist. Because I know that in the past, that kind of error, that kind of mistake would have just made me want to like curl up and die with shame. So I avoided the shame spiral. But what happened later, what I realized later was that I was still just really frustrated and disappointed. I was really sad. I really wanted to go into the garden with my family, and we didn't. And the thing that we did wasn't as fun. It wasn't as good. Like, like I talk all the time about how there's no such thing as failure. There's only data. You learn from your mistakes. But that doesn't mean that when you fail and gather data for the next iteration, it doesn't mean that you're not going to feel sad, that you're not going to feel disappointed. Anyway, I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism was that allowed me to do that, and that would be worth thinking about and talking about for sure. For sure. Dan says, my mom was shame-based. My dad was a rageaholic and an alcoholic, verbally, physically abusive. Yeah. Which caused emotional infidelity in myself. Yeah, Dan, that's tough. Having, I had a little bit of that in my life. Doesn't sound like nearly as intensely as you did, but I get how tough that is, for sure. Peter says, I had an event that I was hosting this week that I put a lot of pressure on myself about how to take care of by myself, and it went really well. I had no idea how to let go of that pressure. Yeah, for sure. Sometimes it just like gets stuck in our body, doesn't it? For sure. Jarek says, I have less than 2 weeks left before my deadline, and I haven't done anything, and I have about 6 weeks of work to do. Help. Yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is. I think that sometimes the answer is, if it's even possible, to just accept that you're not going to meet the deadline. And sometimes the answer is you're going to meet the deadline because you have to, but you're not going to do it as well as you would have if you had the full 6 weeks to do it in. Like those, it seems to me, are the two options, right? Either you miss the deadline or you meet the deadline and don't do it quite as well as you would have. But either way, like shame, feeling ashamed of that isn't going to help. Isn't it? Sometimes just like accepting that this is the situation I'm in. That was sort of my situation this summer in some ways. And just being like, okay, I'm going to do the best I can. It's not going to be the best work I've ever done. But I had a hard deadline with really draconian consequences if I didn't meet it. So I just had to meet it. There you go. Dan says emotional infidelity was a big one. It was the environment I grew up in, so it took me a long time to recognize. Yeah, I think sometimes when something is the air that we breathe, which I think is true of shame for many of us as neurodivergent people, when it's the air that we breathe, it's hard to see. I think that's what Peter was getting at, the how to separate shame from those other experiences when shame is all we know. It can be hard, yeah, for sure. I think that as Ketsia was saying, it's very much a conscious practice, a daily practice, like a contemplative practice that we will have to be in for forever. Yeah, and Dan says, but my mom always cleaned up the mess when my dad shit on the family. Boys learn by observation. Yeah, I think we all learn. So I spent most of my life unlearning everything taught to me. Yep, I feel that. Steph says, I agree so much about the line between ADHD and autism being blurry. I've said before, one day we'll realize they're part of the same spectrum. Not sure it's a linear thing necessarily, though. I agree. Uh, Steph, I agree 100%. I think that that our neurology is just a big spectrum, or maybe more like a matrix, like a three-dimensional matrix. Um, and 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 it's all like mushy in there. That's my experience. Um, Dan, I am gonna read all of these comments, okay? But we're running out of time. I promise I'm gonna read them. But I want to get to a few other people. Invisible design is quoting me back to myself. This is an opportunity to feel ashamed that you're going to resist. I think that's the thing, is that when you start to notice, when you can recognize that, oh, this is a time that I would normally feel ashamed. When you can do that in real time, that's when you're really close to things getting a whole lot better. Like for a really long time, even after I realized the role that shame played, sometimes I would only realize it like in retrospect, like weeks or even months or even years later. I'd be like, oh, right. The reason that that happened and the reason that I avoided that thing was because I felt ashamed. Oh, and actually, there was nothing to feel ashamed about, right? And then the time between the experience of the shame and then the subsequent avoidance, the time between that and my recognition of it gradually got shorter and shorter, sort of through the practice, cultivating this practice until now, most of the time, I can recognize an opportunity for shame in real time. And most of the time now, I have the resources and the support and the love and the community to resist the shame. And then I can just let myself be a human being who feels things like disappointment and fear and sadness, anger, frustration, envy. Like there's a whole host of human experiences that I don't want to like eliminate from my life, but that often would get overwhelmed by shame. Um, Julie says, what Peter said, internal pressure may come from how we rehearse and visualize future events in great detail. Oh, that's a really great observation, Julie, that like, especially, I think a lot of us, no matter how we identify it, I think it's a really considered a really typical autistic trait, but I think that many of us, whether or not we identify as autistic, do this, is that we have these scripts and we rehearse things. Like we have to, right? In a in anticipation of something. And then um, when the thing happens, it doesn't mean that that the that the rehearsal isn't still sort of churning inside of our bodies and our nervous systems. That's really helpful, Julie. Thanks. So when the event doesn't follow the script, life happens, then we become panicked. I would say that even, yes, we become panicked then, but even when the event does follow the script and it goes well, um, I still think that it's often still just like very lodged in our nervous systems and hard to let go of. Okay, I'm to the end of these comments, and oh, there's one more. Sarah says, was just nearly melting down in creative related shame before this live chat, and I feel so much better now. Thank you. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, Sarah. And I'm really excited to get to know you soon in DDS. I do hope you'll come to a peer support group right away. It's the way to, the beating heart of DDS is peer support, and there's no better way to get to know the community. All right, thank you everybody. I was feeling so much anxiety before this live stream, and now I'm feeling so good and excited about this season that Jesse and I are planning for the Spiral Lab, and lots of great things to come. And I think that next week on the live stream, I'm not guaranteeing this, because I still have to think it through a little bit, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about burnout and my experience this summer, and I want to tie it in to, believe it or not, interior design and interior design choices that I made before the burnout, and um, that I think mitigated my burnout and that have helped me come out of the burnout. Um, that's definitely something I'm writing in the newsletter next week, and I do think that I'm also going to make that be the topic of the live stream, although I don't promise. But if you do want to know more about that, I'm definitely writing about that in my newsletter next week, and I will be happy to. Yeah, I'm going to put the link in the description, and if you want to get onto the newsletter list, you can do that. Just one more here. Bug says, yeah, I often do lots of scripting beforehand, and it can be really hard to turn that off afterwards and not keep replaying it and critiquing everything I said. Yeah. Um, and Steve says, thank you, everyone. Great stream. Thank you, Steve. Um, and yes, thank you, everyone, so much for being here. And many of you I will see soon in DDS. We have peer support tomorrow at noon Eastern time, talking about play and rest. And if not, I hope I'll see you next week. I hope I'll see you next week at the Spiral Lab live stream. All right, bye. Yay. All right, take care, everybody.